The last confirmed sighting was on May 3, 1945. A column of 7 Wehrmacht trucks, marked with faded black eagles and escorted by an SS detachment from Division Das Reich, departed from a burned-out rail yard near Linz, Austria. Their route was coded Eclipse Corridor, destination unknown. Within hours, British reconnaissance flights tracked the convoy entering the Salzkammergut region, only to vanish without trace near Lake Toplitz. Locals would later whisper of sealed crates dragged beneath the water and soldiers ordered to shoot anyone who approached. For decades, Operation Eclipse remained an unspoken entry in Allied intelligence, until fragments of its manifest surfaced in a NATO archive mislabeled Obsolete Engineering, 1952. Chapter 1. Operation Eclipse, the Vanished Convoy. In the final months of World War II, the German command structure was disintegrating under the combined weight of Allied and Soviet offensives. Yet, amid the chaos, some units operated with startling precision, following orders that came from no known chain of command. Among these was a convoy recorded in fragmentary Wehrmacht dispatches as Einsatzgruppe Kammler 17 Lau. 7 cargo trucks, 2 Kubelwagens, and a half-track departed from Linz on the night of May 3, 1945, under escort by SS Technical Division personnel. Their orders, authenticated by signatures later identified as forged, instructed them to proceed toward secure Alpine coordinates under Directive Eclipse. The operation bore no correspondence to any official evacuation plan. British intelligence began intercepting garbled transmissions from Austrian relay stations at 0200 hours the next day. RAF monitoring posts noted unusual cipher groups containing the term Epsilon material, a code name unknown to Allied cryptographers. Analysts at Bletchley Park filed it under Class Z miscellaneous. The final intercept, time-stamped 0243, included the phrase "transport onto Feuer reaching objective." No further transmissions followed. 2 days later, when US troops entered Linz, they found the convoy's departure yard abandoned, its registry logs torn from the binders, fuel manifests missing, and the office safe burned from within. Lake Toplitz lay deep in the Austrian Alps, surrounded by dense pine forest and steep rock faces that made access difficult even in peacetime. During the war, the region had become a haven for retreating SS units and scattered Luftwaffe detachments. Locals spoke of late-night activity, of trucks arriving at the lake's edge under floodlights, of heavy crates winched onto barges. American forces, arriving months later, dismissed these reports as folklore. Yet the OSS Regional Command quietly compiled a file. Toplitz Ref 778 ASA. It remained sealed for years. In 1952, a NATO naval research team conducting acoustic testing in the lake made a startling discovery. At a depth of roughly 100 meters, their sonar registered a series of regular geometric reflections, metallic, rectangular, too precise for natural rock. The divers retrieved fragments of a steel container embossed with the Reichsadler and a stylized lightning bolt insignia associated with the SS technical branch. Chemical tests revealed traces of lead shielding and an unusual composite polymer far more advanced than wartime plastics. Radiation readings spiked briefly during retrieval, forcing the dive team into immediate quarantine. The fragments and all reports were seized by US Army intelligence officers within 48 hours. The official record of that expedition lists no anomalous findings. By 1955, several of the scientists involved had disappeared from public life. One, a sonar engineer named Klaus Meindl, was later discovered dead in his Munich apartment, his notebooks confiscated by occupying American authorities. His widow described a visit from 2 men who spoke perfect German but carried no identification. They took every page of his lake survey logs, leaving only an unsigned receipt marked ECL 52 Waus. When she contacted the US consulate, her inquiry was filed under conspiracy correspondence. Declassified fragments from the US Army's G2 division, released decades later under the Freedom of Information Act, refer obliquely to the Kammler material. Hans Kammler, an SS general responsible for many of the Reich's advanced weapons projects, including the V-2 and jet propulsion initiatives, had reportedly committed suicide in Prague in May 1945. Yet multiple intelligence reports from 1946 placed him in American custody under a classified interrogation program. Witnesses described him as cooperative, lucid, and aware of high-value assets located in alpine sectors. Those assets, analysts believe, referred to what the Toplitz convoy had been carrying. The manifest recovered from a decayed ledger, in 1961, now in possession of the Austrian Federal Archives, lists the convoy's cargo cryptically: sealed containers, material Epsilon, do not open without authorization Kammler. Attached was a requisition order stamped by the Reich Ministry of Armaments, but unsigned. Chemical tags found on the recovered steel fragments matched compounds used in early radiation shielding, yet uranium contamination was negligible. Whatever was inside those crates was not standard nuclear material. One internal memorandum, now heavily redacted, references energy transference prototypes and high-frequency gravitational experimentation. Such terms were decades ahead of accepted scientific research in 1945. When American naval divers returned to the lake in 1963 under Operation Aquarian, the site was sealed off under the pretext of environmental contamination. Locals were prohibited from entering the area. Weeks later, Austrian newspapers reported a series of unmarked aircraft landing at a nearby military airstrip. The following month, all mention of Toplitz was scrubbed from official tourism maps. Former OSS operative William T. Laskin, interviewed in 1988, claimed his unit had been tasked with securing certain technological materials from Kammler's team during the German collapse. According to Laskin, they were told not to question the cargo's nature, only to ensure it did not fall into Soviet hands. His team reached the Austrian frontier days too late. Soviet NKVD units had already begun sweeping the region, searching for scientific contraband. A brief firefight was reported near Bad Ischl, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides. The Soviets claimed to have found nothing of value, yet within months, Moscow announced a dramatic leap forward in rocket and jet design. Laskin believed the timing was no coincidence. As the Cold War deepened, Operation Eclipse faded from memory, buried beneath new layers of secrecy. By the late 1970s, NATO classified the incident under historical anomalies, and the remaining documentation was transferred to the European Command Archive in Stuttgart. Researchers who requested access found that the file no longer existed. The catalogue number had been reassigned to a meteorological report from 1954. A handful of surviving witnesses, mostly aging villagers from the Salzkammergut, maintained that something immense still lay beneath Lake Toplitz. Some spoke of muffled detonations under the water in the early 1960s, others of nighttime helicopter operations with American markings. One local diver, a man named Otto Resch, claimed to have seen a light from the lake floor, blue and steady, as if an engine still running. His body was recovered the next morning, cause of death listed as asphyxiation, though his oxygen tanks were full. By the end of the 20th century, Operation Eclipse had become the subject of speculation among historians and conspiracy theorists alike. Yet amid the folklore, a few solid pieces of evidence remain: the burned convoy logs, the intercepted transmissions, and the fragment bearing Kammler's insignia. The official story insists that the lake contains only counterfeit currency and scuttled Nazi archives. But classified correspondence between the CIA and the Bundesnachrichtendienst from 1964 tells another story. One paragraph, entirely unredacted, reads, "If material Epsilon exists, its containment priority exceeds atomic classification. Under no circumstances should public discovery be permitted." The meaning of that sentence has never been clarified. Neither have the events of that May night in 1945, when the trucks rolled into the mountains and vanished. What became of Kammler's convoy, its drivers, guards, and cargo, remains an unanswered question resting beneath the cold waters of Lake Toplitz, sealed away by the silence of those who knew and the deliberate erasure of those who still remember. Chapter 2. The Eclipse Files Resurface. In March 1952, an unmarked envelope arrived at a British military post office in Bonn. It contained 4 faded photographs, each depicting a convoy of Wehrmacht trucks parked beside an alpine lake. On the reverse side of one photo was a handwritten note in German. They never left the valley. The envelope bore no return address, no fingerprints, and no traceable ink origin. The images were soon forwarded to MI6 Section D, where analysts linked them to earlier intelligence on Operation Eclipse, a file that had lain dormant since the war's end. The timing was peculiar. NATO had just formalized its defense alliance, and Western agencies were aggressively collecting any information that could preempt Soviet technological advances. The sudden reappearance of Eclipse-related evidence triggered an urgent reassessment of what had been buried, and by whom, declassified. Minutes from the April 1952 meeting of the Allied Intelligence Coordination Committee describe a tense exchange between British and American officers. Colonel Arthur Wakefield, representing the CIA's European Command, insisted the photographs were Soviet disinformation, designed to stir Western paranoia about missing Nazi technology. Yet British cryptanalyst Harold Stenton disagreed. He pointed out that the vehicles in the photos bore unit markings consistent with Kammler's Waffenamt Sonderkommando, the very department responsible for the Reich's most advanced experimental projects. Moreover, the terrain matched the topography of Lake Toplitz precisely, down to the distinctive ridgeline above the water's edge. Wakefield ordered the photographs sealed under NATO classification AE 1521, Eclipse. Within weeks, an Anglo-American joint mission was authorized under the innocuous label Arctic Weather Research Program. The operation deployed a small team of Royal Navy divers and US engineers from the Office of Naval Research. Their cover story, testing sonar equipment for Arctic monitoring stations. In reality, they were searching for Kammler's missing cargo. The team established a base camp near the southern shore of Toplitz in June 1952. Local authorities were instructed to keep civilians away, citing unexploded ordnance hazards. During the first week of dives, sonar scans revealed irregular metallic echoes approximately 100 meters below the surface, forming a rough grid pattern. On June 12th, divers recovered a corroded cylindrical canister containing reels of undeveloped film. Laboratory analysis later confirmed that the emulsions were manufactured in 1944 by AGFA and exposed on high-resolution reconnaissance stock typically reserved for Luftwaffe mapping units. The negatives, once processed, displayed diagrams of complex mechanical assemblies, coils, magnetic housings, and what appeared to be turbine structures labeled Vortex Motor Type 13 Aus. The technical notations were consistent with experimental propulsion research, yet no known German project matched that designation. When the discovery reached Washington, the Pentagon abruptly recalled the US contingent. The remaining British personnel were instructed to stand down. The recovered canister and all related reports were transported to the American Embassy in Vienna and then vanished from record. According to surviving mission logs, Commander Edward Ross, the Royal Navy's lead diver, filed an official protest. Within months, he was reassigned to Malta and his clearance revoked. Ross's private notes, recovered years later from his family estate, contained a chilling line. They found what they were looking for, but it wasn't ours to find. Throughout the 1950s, fragments of the Eclipse story continued to surface. A German engineer living in Argentina claimed to have worked under Kammler in late April 1945, assisting with heavy transports bound for the Alpine fortress. He described crates stamped with radiation warnings and electrical hazard symbols, and he mentioned hearing the codename Project Epsilon. His testimony was dismissed by Allied debriefers as unreliable, yet several details matched the earlier intercepts from 1945. The same year, Soviet intelligence reports retrieved from the East German Stasi archives referenced an NKVD mission named Operation Zarya, ordered to intercept a German convoy carrying materials of non-conventional energy application. Soviet search teams scoured the Austrian frontier for months but reported only scuttled vehicles and empty crates. Moscow later classified the incident as a logistical mirage. Then, in 1957, a former OSS cryptologist named Walter Brewer defected to West Germany and presented journalists with a document he claimed to have smuggled out of the Pentagon archives, a memorandum from the Office of Scientific Intelligence, referencing containment protocols for Epsilon material. The document was authentic in format and language, though most of its content had been blacked out. Only 2 legible phrases remained. contamination risk, non-radioactive, and energy displacement field tests, Austrian sector. Within 48 hours of the leak, Breuer was found dead in his Frankfurt hotel room. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, though witnesses recalled the room being ransacked. The memorandum vanished. By the early 1960s, Operation Eclipse had become a diplomatic liability. Austria, seeking neutrality between East and West, requested that foreign military activities within its borders be curtailed. In response, the US and Britain jointly declared that no evidence of Nazi scientific material remains in Austrian territory. The Toplitz files were quietly transferred from the Foreign Office to a NATO sub-archive in Brussels, where they remained classified until the 1980s. Yet whispers persisted within intelligence circles. A 1962 NORAD briefing, later declassified, refers to epsilon anomalies detected during magnetospheric readings over Central Europe. The notation source terrestrial unknown was later crossed out in red ink. In 1963, Austrian divers conducting independent exploration of the lake discovered what they believed to be a steel vault, partially buried in sediment. Before they could return with proper equipment, the Austrian Interior Ministry abruptly prohibited all private diving operations at Toplitz, citing hazardous chemical waste. Days later, an unidentified aircraft, painted in US Air Force colors but lacking serial numbers, was seen hovering over the lake at night, shining a spotlight on the water. The pilot's identity was never confirmed. Local police reports describing the event were removed from municipal archives 2 years later. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a new agency had taken interest in the Eclipse files. The Defense Intelligence Agency, formed in 1961, began compiling a comprehensive index of unrecovered wartime technology. A memo from Director Joseph Carroll, dated January 12, 1964, includes the line, "Epsilon material classified under unverified category. Subject, gravitational stress energy propulsion. Possible Nazi prototype recovered, Austria sector. Recommend indefinite classification." This phrasing, deliberately vague, indicated that at least some physical evidence had been retrieved. Yet no record exists of where it was stored or what tests were conducted. By the 1970s, as the Cold War intensified, Eclipse became one of several ghost files circulating among NATO analysts, topics spoken of only in rumour, their details buried beneath redactions. A handful of independent researchers tried to piece together the story using local testimonies and scattered declassified memos. One of them, historian Dr. Otto Kessner, published a monograph in 1978 titled Kammler's Last Convoy. He argued that Operation Eclipse represented a last-ditch attempt to transport the Reich's most advanced research out of reach of both Allies and Soviets. 2 months after publication, Kessner's home was burglarized, his research notes stolen. Austrian police filed no report. The book was quietly pulled from circulation, its publisher citing legal irregularities. The Eclipse case resurfaced briefly in 1985 when a BBC documentary on wartime secrets aired a short segment on Lake Toplitz. The footage included sonar images resembling large containers resting on the lakebed. Within days, the broadcast was withdrawn from repeat scheduling. The producer, Alistair Hume, later stated that government officials had advised him of historical sensitivities. When he pressed for clarification, he was told only that the matter pertains to inter-allied agreements still in force. To this day, researchers accessing NATO's classified holdings occasionally encounter reference codes that trace back to the Eclipse Index. One recurring notation appears across multiple Cold War-era intelligence summaries. AE 1521 remains active. No explanation accompanies the entry, but archivists note that active classification is reserved for material considered ongoing or relevant to present operations. Whether the vanished convoy's cargo still lies beneath the waters of Lake Toplitz, or whether it was quietly retrieved and absorbed into modern research, remains unknown. What is clear is that every attempt to bring the truth to light has been met with silence, redaction, and sudden disappearance. Chapter 3. The Kammler Connection. Hans Kammler's name appears at the intersection of nearly every missing file and untraceable shipment during the Third Reich's final months. Officially, he was reported dead, self-inflicted gunshot near Prague, May 9, 1945, yet the absence of a body, combined with inconsistent testimonies, has led historians and intelligence officers alike to suspect otherwise. Kammler was not a bureaucrat. He was a logistical engineer of the highest order, responsible for designing the underground facilities that sheltered Germany's rocket and jet programs. His authority extended over secret sites such as Mittelwerk, Peenemünde, and the Harz complex. When Berlin fell, he controlled both the scientists and the blueprints that the Allies coveted most. If anyone had reason means and access to orchestrate Operation Eclipse, it was him. The earliest Allied reference to Kammler post-1945 appears in a declassified OSS report dated September 17th of that year. It describes an unnamed German general with knowledge of advanced energy research allegedly, captured near Salzburg by US forces and subsequently transferred to a technical evaluation. Detachment. The name Kammler is handwritten in the report's margin, followed by a question mark and the initials JM, likely those of Colonel James McCarthy, OSS liaison for post-war scientific retrieval. A month later, the same file was stamped inactive. Its disappearance coincided with the founding of Operation Paperclip, the program that brought dozens of Nazi scientists, including Werner von Braun, to the United States. Kammler's absence from the list is peculiar. His expertise would have been invaluable, yet he is missing from all personnel transfers. Another clue lies within Soviet archives. A classified NKVD cable, decrypted decades later, references the disappearance of high-priority target H. Kammler, believed under American protection. The Soviets accused Washington of concealing him to monopolize his research. In response, US intelligence denied knowledge of his survival, but began restricting access to captured German documents that mentioned his projects. Among those restricted files was a technical report titled Project Schwerkraftfeld, Preliminary Results, detailing experimental propulsion research at a facility near Prague. The document's author is listed as Obergruppenführer H. Kammler. Though some historians have dismissed the report as pseudoscience, others note that the terminology anticipates post-war studies on gravity manipulation and field propulsion by at least 2 decades. In 1948, a confidential US Army memorandum labeled ECL 948-2 described the possible utilization of personnel formerly assigned to Kammler's divisions for experimental containment work. The site mentioned, Camp Grable, is believed to correspond to a restricted area at White Sands, New Mexico. The memo's language suggests that the Eclipse materials may have been transported from Europe and repurposed under military oversight. While the contents of Material Epsilon remain unknown, the reference to containment implies a volatile or incompletely understood energy source rather than conventional weaponry. Radiation logs from the period record minor anomalies at storage depots associated with atomic testing, though no nuclear material was logged. By the early 1950s, sightings of Kammler began to surface from unexpected quarters. A Czech railway worker claimed to have transported a high-ranking German officer from Prague to Innsbruck in May 1945, guarded by American soldiers. The description matched Kammler's known appearance: tall, pale, distinct scar across his left cheek. Similar accounts appeared in Argentine immigration records from 1948, listing a Karl Hammer, engineer, born 1901 in Stettin, the same year and birthplace as Kammler. The photograph attached to the document was later removed. US consular notes indicate the file was transferred to Special Section and sealed indefinitely. The deeper intelligence analysts dug, the more the Eclipse files appeared to orbit Kammler's missing identity. In 1959, CIA researcher Robert Sandler compiled an internal assessment, Project Epsilon Review. He concluded that Operation Eclipse was a strategic extraction, plan executed under Kammler's direct supervision to relocate experimental assets beyond enemy acquisition. Sandler traced financial transfers from the Reichspost Treasury to Swiss accounts controlled by front companies such as Eidgenössische Maschinenwerke GmbH. From there, funds were funneled into post-war engineering firms working on classified aerospace contracts in both East and West Germany. The pattern suggested that the scientific legacy of the Third Reich had been quietly integrated into the technological race of the Cold War, its origins erased, its architects dispersed. Then came the discovery that shifted the investigation's tone. In 1967, during a NATO document audit in Brussels, an archivist stumbled upon a misfiled envelope labeled ECL 1745. Inside was a single carbon copy of an order bearing Kamler's name, dated April 29, 1945. The order authorized the secure transfer of high-value experimental apparatus and related technical Personell to Alpenstützpunkt Epsilon. The location coordinates corresponded to the Salzkammergut region. At the bottom of the document was an unfamiliar signature. Dr. H. Kruger, SS Technical Evaluation Staff. Historical records confirm that Kruger disappeared after the war. The implication was chilling. Kamler had formalized Operation Eclipse as one of his last official acts before Germany's collapse. Despite this, official Western policy continued to deny Kamler's post-war existence. Publicly, he was a dead man. Privately, the intelligence community treated his name as a cipher, a placeholder for something larger. In 1971, a Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, briefing titled Historical Theoretical Propulsion Studies listed Kamler Eclipse, source obscured, as an ancestral node to several classified experiments. No technical details were given. When asked decades later, former DARPA consultant Dr. Joseph Harrington admitted that Kamler was a ghost we all knew was real. His work was the seed. We were only the gardeners. Historians attempting to trace Kamler's lineage in the late 20th century encountered a wall of silence. German archives maintained that all relevant files were destroyed. The US National Archives holds only scattered fragments, letters, budget sheets, and an index card marked Subject Neutralized. Yet the pattern of omission itself tells a story. Every mention of epsilon is either blacked out or replaced with innocuous language like materials of industrial significance. When researchers pressed for transparency, they were told that the records were not relevant to historical research, a classification typically reserved for active intelligence assets. There is one final reference, found in a 1998 NATO declassification roll. Document AE 152109 lists a 1951 communication between the US Air Research and Development Command and the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. The message reads simply, Epsilon assets integrated, source HK secured, status permanent. No context, no elaboration, and no further correspondence. The phrasing implies that Kamler, or what remained of his work, had been successfully incorporated into Western defense research. If that is true, then the man officially declared dead in 1945 may have continued his life under protection, feeding his designs into the machinery of a new global order. To this day, historians disagree whether Kamler escaped, was executed, or was absorbed by one of the Allied powers. What cannot be denied is his fingerprint upon the secret history of technological development in the decades following the war. The missing trucks, the sealed crates, the erased files, all point back to the same architect. Operation Eclipse was not a desperate retreat. It was a controlled handover, executed under the cover of defeat. Whether that handover was to the Americans, the Soviets, or some unseen coalition of both, remains one of the darkest enigmas of the 20th century. Chapter 4. Retrieval Attempts and Silenced Witnesses. In the early months of 1963, almost 2 decades after Kamler's supposed death, a quiet memo circulated through the US Army Corps of Engineers in Europe. It authorized hydrographic survey operations near Lake Toplitz to be conducted jointly with Austrian military observers. The operation, internally coded Project Aquarian, was headed by Major Richard H. Leland, a veteran of earlier NATO logistics missions. The memo's tone was bureaucratic, its objectives vague, yet a secondary attachment stamped. 52, restricted access, mentioned recovery of WWII. Submerged materials consistent with prior Eclipse. Assets. Few on Leland's team knew the term Eclipse. Fewer still realized the risks. Involved in reopening a file that official history had already buried, the mission began. Under the cover of environmental research, engineers established a temporary camp along the western shore of the lake, deploying portable sonar and magnetic sensors. The first 2 weeks yielded unremarkable results. Sediment layers, fallen timber, standard debris. Then, on June 8th, the sonar began returning symmetrical echoes that repeated in intervals, metallic, evenly spaced, lying roughly 90 meters below the surface. Divers confirmed the presence of large rectangular structures half buried in mud. They described the objects as box-like, smooth-faced, and cold to the touch, despite the water's near-freezing temperature. Leland's field journal recorded 4 major anomalies aligned in a perfect grid. Impossible to be natural. Recommend deeper survey. 2 days later, one of the divers, Lieutenant Paul Hendricks, failed to surface. His line went slack at 30 meters, then snapped. Emergency divers recovered his body an hour later. The autopsy listed asphyxiation, but oxygen readings from his tanks indicated no malfunction. His hands, however, bore severe chemical burns inconsistent with the surrounding water. Samples of the residue were sent to the US Embassy laboratory in Vienna. The results were never returned. Instead, a single-page telegram arrived, signed by the defense attaché. Cease testing, report concluded. Within 24 hours, Project Aquarian was terminated. Leland's team was reassigned, their logs confiscated by officers claiming to represent European Command, Technical Liaison Section. That section, according to the Pentagon's organizational chart, did not exist. For a time, the matter appeared closed. Then, in 1967, a journalist for the Salzburger Nachrichten, Anton Frey, began investigating rumors surrounding the Toplitz operations. Frey interviewed local forest rangers who claimed to have seen US military helicopters conducting night flights over the lake shortly after Aquarian's termination. He collected testimonies, sketches, and even fragments of unfamiliar metallic alloy retrieved by fishermen from tangled nets. Before his report could be published, Frey's apartment was burglarized and his notes stolen. 3 weeks later, he was found dead in a car crash on the Alpine road between Bad Ischl and Hallstatt. Austrian authorities ruled it accidental, though witnesses recalled hearing explosions moments before the wreck. His surviving family received an unsigned letter warning them not to pursue historical fiction. By the early 1970s, the Eclipse file had achieved mythical status within intelligence circles. Officers who had participated in the lake operations whispered about light under the ice, about energy readings without a source. Few suggested that the operation had uncovered an unfinished experimental power system designed by Kamler's engineers, an engine based on magnetogravitational principles. Others dismissed it as Cold War paranoia, an elaborate cover story for more mundane military research. The truth may lie somewhere between. Internal NATO communications from 1974 mention a containment hazard in the Austrian sector, possibly related to residual materials of pre-war German origin. The reference number matches the old Eclipse designation, AE 1521. Throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, European environmental agencies began reporting unusual contamination levels in lakes adjacent to former wartime research sites. One internal memo from the Austrian Geological Institute cited elevated isotopic anomalies near Toplitz, despite no evidence of nuclear waste. When investigators requested access to military records, their correspondence was redirected to the US Defense Intelligence Agency, which denied involvement. An Austrian parliament inquiry in 1982 formally asked whether foreign powers had conducted unauthorized operations on national territory. The US Embassy responded with a single sentence: no activities of a military nature were undertaken in that area. That denial, curiously, was classified for 20 years. Amid the bureaucratic silence, a few individuals refused to let the mystery die. One of them was Dr. Ingrid Wolf, a physicist at the University of Munich. In 1984, Wolf published a paper analyzing fragments of alloy reportedly recovered from Toplitz. The composition included elements of titanium, vanadium, and a rare isotope of barium not used in industrial production until decades after the war. Her findings were quickly discredited by official scientific bodies, and her funding was withdrawn. 2 years later, Wolf disappeared while traveling to Vienna for a conference. Her hotel room was found undisturbed. Her luggage remained unpacked. Austrian police filed her case as missing person, presumed deceased. Her research notes, stored at the university, were confiscated by unidentified men who claimed to represent federal safety inspectors. The department secretary later recalled that the inspectors spoke fluent American English. Parallel to these disappearances, NATO internal memos reveal at least 2 additional retrieval attempts. The first, in 1978, was conducted under the guise of Joint Alpine Hydrology Project. The second, in 1981, operated through a civilian contractor, Oceanic Dynamics Limited, ostensibly mapping underwater geology. Both projects ended abruptly with no data released. In each case, funding came from the same source, an untraceable account tied to a Pentagon black budget line item labeled Epsilon Development. When journalists inquired, defense officials described it as an administrative placeholder. The last known expedition occurred in 1992. Led by an independent salvage team from Hamburg, it used modern submersibles equipped with cameras. Their footage, released briefly to a private television channel, showed structures resembling reinforced vaults and metallic containers scattered along the lakebed. Within weeks, the footage was confiscated under Austrian national security orders, citing potential risk to public health. Members of the salvage team later reported being followed, their offices broken into, and their bank accounts audited. The project's leader, Dieter Weber, publicly stated in a radio interview that he had seen something that changed what we know about the end of the war. He died 2 months later in what police described as a sudden act of self-harm. His colleagues dispute that conclusion. Through the 1990s and beyond, attempts to revisit Lake Toplitz have been met with bureaucratic obstruction and occasionally quiet intimidation. Requests for permits vanish. Archival files return empty. Researchers find their communications inexplicably intercepted. Satellite imaging of the lake area remains restricted under European defense agreements, despite no current military installations. In 2005, an Austrian investigative journalist petitioned to reopen the Eclipse case under the country's transparency law. The Ministry of Defense denied the request on grounds of ongoing Allied classification. The classification authority cited AE 1521. By the start of the 21st century, what remained of the Eclipse investigation had fragmented across 3 continents. A handful of scattered documents in national archives, second-hand testimony from long-retired intelligence officers, and the enduring myth of Kamler's missing convoy. Every witness who tried to expose the truth met with silence or tragedy. Every official acknowledgement was followed by redaction. The few surviving pages speak in euphemisms: containment, energy transfer, protective custody. They hint at a discovery whose implications reached far beyond the closing days of 1945. Whatever lies beneath the dark waters of Lake Toplitz was significant, enough to outlast the war, the Cold War, and every supposed end of secrecy that followed. Chapter 5: The Classified Legacy of Eclipse. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the archives of the East German Stasi were hurriedly catalogued and partially opened to Western analysts. Among the debris of shredded files and coded reels, an unmarked folder caught the attention of British historian Michael Green, then assisting in document recovery for MI6 liaison. The folder contained microfilm labelled Epsilon Kamler Archive, copy 3 of 7 WOW. Most of the film was blank or degraded, but one frame survived. A typed list of technical schematics dated April 1945, referencing Stützpunkt Epsilon, device for mass reduction of field density. The language was impenetrable even to physicists, but the document's provenance was clear. It originated from Kamler's SS Technical Division. The fragment reignited official curiosity that had lain dormant for years. Within a week, NATO's intelligence branch classified the find as level black and retrieved the film under armed escort. From that point forward, Operation Eclipse ceased to be a historical footnote and re-entered the orbit of modern defense secrecy. The surviving references trace a pattern of unusual research initiatives through the early 1990s. Projects cloaked in vague names like Field Integrity Analysis and Nonlinear Propulsion Review. The institutions involved were legitimate: Fraunhofer Institute, Los Alamos National Laboratory, and a handful of private aerospace contractors. Funding trails, uncovered years later through European budget hearings, show that each received grants under a NATO energy dispersal study, coded AE 1521, the same number assigned to Eclipse in 1952. The connection was not officially acknowledged, but internal memos referred to heritage data from Epsilon source material. In 1995, a declassified memorandum from the US Defense Technical Information Center summarized decades of fragmented findings. It stated, without elaboration, that Epsilon materials remain unstable in terrestrial conditions and must remain isolated until reverse field calibration is feasible. The phrasing was extraordinary. Unstable in terrestrial conditions implied that whatever Kamler's team had developed, if it truly existed, operated under principles incompatible with conventional physics. Some analysts interpreted it as a translation error from German. Others suggested deliberate obfuscation, but accompanying notes from the same file mentioned containment under vacuum, resonance, terminology unknown to any wartime or post-war field until much later in classified research circles. The secrecy surrounding these references intensified in the early 2000s. Freedom of Information Act requests made by journalists and historians were returned with near-total redaction, except for marginal notes confirming that documents pertaining to Operation Eclipse remained classified for national security reasons under Executive Order 2256, Technological Assets of Foreign Origin. The clause, foreign origin, puzzled researchers. The war had ended 60 years earlier, and all Axis powers were long defunct. Still, the documents retained that label, as if the source of the technology, or the event, had transcended the original wartime context. Meanwhile, Austria, pressured by public curiosity, launched its own internal review in 2003, the Toplitz Sea Commission. Comprising historians, engineers, and military representatives, the commission received limited access to local military archives but was denied clearance to inspect NATO files. Their 2005 report concluded only that unidentified metallic structures remained within the lake, sealed by sediments, and that prior foreign operations had indeed taken place between 1946 and 1992. The report also noted the disappearance of 4 crates documented by the OSS in 1947 as recovered near Bad Ischl, contents unknown. The official conclusion: no further investigation warranted. Behind closed doors, however, Austrian defense representatives conceded that they were not in control of their own lake. During this same period, independent researcher Michael Green, the man who had found the Stasi microfilm, began receiving anonymous correspondence. Enclosed were partial translations of German technical reports describing a field oscillator, a device capable of producing localized gravitational distortions. Though the descriptions were vague, the terminology matched the surviving fragments from the Epsilon Kamler document. Green published his findings in a limited academic journal in 2007, suggesting that Eclipse might have involved early experimentation with electromagnetic field propulsion. Within weeks, the journal's digital archive was hacked and wiped clean. Green himself vanished a year later while traveling in Poland. His rental car was discovered abandoned near the Sudetes Mountains, ironically, not far from the ruins of Kamler's wartime complexes. Throughout the 2010s, hints of the Eclipse legacy surfaced in unexpected places. A declassified patent filed by an American aerospace firm describing mass variable propulsion, European satellite readings showing unexplained magnetic anomalies over the Salzkammergut, and leaked NATO procurement lists referencing containment maintenance in Austria. Every trail led back to the same coded project number, AE 1521. In 2014, a document leaked to a German newspaper briefly mentioned reactivation of legacy containment site in Alpine sector before it was withdrawn under threat of legal action, citing national defense exemption. The war location corresponded precisely to the coordinates of Lake Toplitz. By 2018, the narrative of Operation Eclipse had transformed from myth to measured suspicion among historians. A conference held in Prague under the title Secret Technologies of the Second World War devoted an entire panel to Kamler's disappearance. One Czech historian presented newly discovered interrogation notes from a former NKVD officer. The notes described a prisoner transferred from American custody to Soviet hands in late 1946, identity redacted but listed as expert in gravity field experimentation. The officer's comment read, "Americans pretended ignorance, but they had already taken the device." The audience dismissed it as disinformation, yet the handwriting and official stamps were genuine. In 2020, newly digitized NATO indices accidentally released a reference entry under inactive operations. Among them was Eclipse Epsilon Integration Status Monitoring. The record was promptly removed within 24 hours, but not before researchers archived a screenshot. Its existence confirmed what many suspected, that Eclipse, whatever it had been, remained an active classification. To this day, no government acknowledges the project, yet its echoes persist in every fragment of the declassified defense budgets, in the anomalies left unexamined beneath the waters of the Salzkammergut, and in the faint magnetic hum that still registers on deep spectrum instruments whenever survey teams pass over the lake. 75 years after the last German convoy vanished into those mountains, The question endures. What did they bury and why was it never meant to be found? Those who have seen the recovered fragments, engineers, divers, intelligence officers, speak cautiously of something powerful, unstable, perhaps incomprehensible. It was not a weapon in the conventional sense, but an experiment in controlling energy itself. If that is true, then Operation Eclipse was not about hiding the past. It was about hiding the future, a future that began in 1945 and remains classified, locked somewhere beneath the black, silent water of Lake Toplitz. In the sealed archives of both Washington and Vienna, the file known as AE 1521 remains unreviewed, its pages untouched for decades. Officially, it no longer exists. Unofficially, it is still monitored. Each attempt to unseal the record ends in quiet denial or unexplained disappearance. Satellite images of Lake Toplitz are still censored, and the same coordinates appear again and again in modern NATO encryption logs, filed under legacy containment. Whether Kamler's convoy carried blueprints, weapons, or something far stranger, no government has ever dared to release the truth. The last memo recovered from the Eclipse dossier carried a single sentence, stamped in faded red ink. Containment must be absolute until verification of stability in field conditions. No one has ever confirmed what that field was, or if it's still active.